Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 16th of August of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First, we're going to start not with the Bradley Square, but with Kherson area, with this small front line, because as I understand, this area is going to become one of the most important front line probably in a month or in a month and a half. For now, there is still a preparation of Ukrainian special operation. They probably are going to implement such a type of operation. So let's start step by step. As we discussed in the previous video, the Russians, as a result of offensive or counter-offensive operation in this area, managed to clear this bank of the river of Kazachye Lagery. They managed to capture the settlements and the high-rising buildings in the western part of the settlement, and basically they forced the Ukrainians to step back and to retreat on their bank of Dnieper River. But other Russian military experts are saying that there are still commando squads on this bank of the river, are moving along the forest lines, and they're stretched in this area, and the Russians are currently trying to capture them and to destroy them or something like this. Furthermore, during the day, the Russians made lots of artillery and missile and bombings of the Ukrainian positions on their side of the river. For example, in the vicinity of Lvova and Korsunka, the second possible area where the Ukrainians are planning to start offensive operation, the Russians were bombing the islands with the guided bombs. On this video, we see how the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian positions, their boats or something like this, and after that, as a result of bombings or artillery strike, those boats were destroyed. Furthermore, this is not the first video from this area. If we increase the number of updates, we're gonna see that almost the same time, almost the same days, a few days ago, we got another video from another point of these islands. The Russians also were bombing this area, and probably they were bombing the Ukrainian positions and accumulation of their forces. A little bit to the north, the Russians destroyed the Ukrainian positions inside the building, also with the guided bombs. So as I understand, there is a very powerful accumulation of Ukrainian forces in this area that Ukrainians have already prepared before the next attack, before the next attempt to attack and to land their forces in the vicinity of Korsunka. At least a lot of sources confirm this information. Furthermore, the Russians were bombing the Ukrainians a little bit to the west from Kazachye Lagery in the vicinity of Pridnestrovskaya. On this area, the Russians also were using the guided bombs, and as a result of one of those strikes, the Russians managed to destroy probably ammo depot or another accumulation of Ukrainian forces. Furthermore, the Ukrainians, of course, as we discussed, that the main reason why the Russians managed to force the Ukrainians to step back from this bridgehead is that they managed to suppress the Ukrainian artillery systems on their bank of the river. As we discussed yesterday, for example, there was a video of Lancet strike which shown us the Russians discovered M777 howitzer and destroyed. Of course, these counter-artillery duels always lead to losses from both sides. For example, the Russians managed to suppress the Ukrainian artillery systems, but by those attacks they discovered their own artillery positions, and today the Ukrainians destroyed, at least the Ukrainian sources published the video, how they discovered and destroyed the Russian D-20 howitzers in this area. At least 2 D-20 howitzers were destroyed as a result of artillery strike from the Ukrainian side. We see the smoke on the north of this road. This area is geolocated, and a little bit later, so 2 artillery systems were destroyed by the Ukrainians. So we see intensifying of actions in this area. Furthermore, the Ukrainians are saying that they continue, the Ukrainian sources and the Russian sources confirm this information, that Ukrainians continue accumulation of their forces in the vicinity of Patanovka, Novotaganka, Takarovka, Ivanovka, so basically on the line in front of Kazachye Lagery. The sources are saying that Ukrainians have already accumulated 1,500 soldiers on this line. So it's almost 75% of entire brigade, and the main purpose of this brigade will be to repeat the landing operation and to capture Kazachye Lagery with one strike. So this is the Ukrainian mission, this is the Ukrainian plan, and basically as a result, as a main goal of upcoming landing operation is to establish control over Kazachye Lagery, and Karsunka. These two settlements, this will allow the Ukrainians to create some bridgehead that they will try to develop further to the south, to the west, and to the east. Furthermore, but this is not those were not the final updates from this bridgehead. For example, today the Ukrainian sources published another video on the south of Kherson area. On this video, we see how the Ukrainian drones managed to discover the Russian training center on the south of Kherson. Probably they were on some polygon, making some exercises with guns and so on, with shootings, and the Ukrainians discovered this area, and after that the Ukrainians made HIMARS attack. We will not watch the video till the end because of losses among the Russian soldiers. Basically, during those exercises, the Russians lost at least few platoons of soldiers in this area. And the most important part of this video is that this is not the first case of losses of the Russians on this side of Kherson area. If we increase the number of days since the beginning of August, we're gonna see that at least yesterday we discussed that Ukrainians managed with HIMARS and with drones managed to discover the Russian S-300's launching systems and to destroy these systems with HIMARS missiles. So we see that first the Ukrainians suppressed and destroyed Russian air defense systems, and after that they destroyed a small military camp on the south of Kherson area. Furthermore, if you remember, in the beginning of August we got another video from the Ukrainian side when they have discovered the Russian positions, Russian forces along those islands, some fortifications, trenches, as you can see, and after that they made a launch and strike in this area with HIMARS as well. From that video we don't have possibility to calculate the losses. Probably the Russians managed to hide in the trenches, but anyway we see a real concentration of Ukrainian forces, of Ukrainian artillery forces and intelligence forces exactly in the southern part. First the Ukrainians suppressed the Russian air defense. Now the Ukrainians are trying to suppress and to destroy the Russian manpower along these islands in the southern part of Kherson. So as I understand, and as we discussed in the past, there is a very high chances that the Ukrainians will try to attack and to land and to make a landing operation in the southern part of Kherson as well. I'm not saying that this operation could be effective, but we see the Ukrainian activity in this area, and probably this operation might be one of possible explanation of Ukrainian activities in this area. So one more time. First attack of Ukrainian forces is going to be on the line between Kazachye Lagery and small settlement Karsunka. The second direction of attack possibly is going to be islands on the south of Kherson. And of course, the most obvious direction of Ukrainian attack, if those two are successful, is in direction of Kinbur Island, of Kinbur area. So these are possible three directions of Ukrainian attacks that possibly there is a high likely these operations are going to take place within a month or months and a half because of all events and all evidence that we just discussed. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings in Kherson area, the Ukrainians lost another 35 soldiers and 5 armored vehicles. Now we're moving further to Zaporozhye area, and before we start discussion the Bradley Square, we are going to talk a little bit about Energodar. Today the Russians published the video of another military exercises inside of the nuclear power plant using armored vehicles, infantry and so on. The Russians had exercises and military exercises about the repelling the Ukrainian possible storming operation. So as you can see, the Russians published video just today, but probably that was some kind of message to the Ukrainians where the Russians were trying to show them that the Russians are ready and the Russians expect the Ukrainians in this small settlement. And also these exercises also some kind of evidence of possible Ukrainian attempt to attack in this direction, also even within the August by the end of August of 2023. And now we are moving to Zaporozhye area, and probably we will start the Zaporozhye area with the Bradley Square. And the Russians reported that as a result of clashes in the Zaporozhye area, basically on the Bradley Square, the Ukrainians lost 170 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system. The Russians reported that they managed to repel at least 2 attacks in direction of Verbova from the forces of 82nd Air Mobile Brigade. Basically, Rabotina currently is split in two parts. The northern part is under Ukrainian control and the southern part is under the Russian control. Today the Russians published the video how the Ukrainian infantry was moving along the settlement in the northern part. As you can see, there are like two soldiers who were moving to the south, and after that the Russians discovered them and made artillery strike, which confirms that the northern part or is in the gray zone or is under Ukrainian control. Furthermore, today the Ukrainians made a lot of attempts to attack the settlement, or not to attack the settlement, but to develop the bridgehead to the south between Verbova and Rabotina. For these purposes, the Ukrainians were using T-72 tanks, Leopards tanks, and of course Strykers. And for example, today the Russians reported that as a result of Ukrainian offensive operation in that area, they managed to destroy three Strykers, and we can start joking that probably Bradley Square is soon going to be called as Stryker Square because of number of destroyed Strykers in the fields between Rabotina and Verbova. On this video we see how two Ukrainian tanks Leopards managed to get as close as possible to the Russian defense belt. They were trying to attack the Russian defense belt with tanks, trying to suppress the Russian infantry and so on, but of course this situation was tracked by the Russian forces, by drones, by intelligence, and at some moment the Russians start bombing and shelling this area. From the first second they managed to destroy one tank. The second tank turned its direction, started moving to the north, but the second tank was also destroyed when moving and when withdrawing their position. On this side of the flank, we see how the Russians discovered the Ukrainian T-72 tank, and as a result of drone strike of one drone, that tank was damaged, really damaged, and destroyed after that. So as you can see, there were a lot of attempts from the Ukrainian side to attack, to capture positions, but currently the main problem for the Ukrainians still remains Rabotina and the eastern fortifications and the southern fortifications of the settlement. Also, the Ukrainians lost a lot of armored vehicles, tanks and armored vehicles on this defense belt. They lost at least 3 Strykers and 2 Leopards tanks, and as of results of today, the Ukrainians still haven't managed to penetrate this defense belt, to capture Rabotina, or to develop their bridgehead further to the south in direction of Novopokrovka. Today, the Ukrainians lost the battle one more time. Furthermore, today the Ukrainians changed their focus when talking about drones attacks. For example, for the previous days we got a lot of updates of drone strikes in direction of Rabotina, but today the Ukrainians were mainly concentrated on Verbova. On this video we see how the Ukrainians managed to discover the Russian ammo depot, and as a result of artillery strike that ammo depot was destroyed. Probably the Russians were using that ammo depot for supplying and supporting their forces on the combat line. On this video we see also another very interesting video from the Ukrainian side, and this is probably one of the videos when the Ukrainians try to show the benefits and advantages of their own drone by the name of Poseidon. So this is like Ukraine attempt to create something like Lancet but of Ukrainian production, and this is Poseidon. We see that Poseidon managed to discover the target. From this video and from the author of this video, I didn't understand whether the Poseidon would attack the building or it's just navigated and coordinated the Russian attack in this area. It's very difficult to understand, but anyway we see the Ukrainian concentration over Verbova, massive concentration, which also tell us that probably the next target and the next aim of the Ukrainian forces in this area is going to be Verbova. And at some point the Ukrainians will turn their movement and will start moving in direction of the settlement. As I understand, the Ukrainians currently are trying to move to the south and to attack the settlement from the southeast. So basically this is the main purpose of the Ukrainians, between the trenches, between the two types of different forces of the Russian side, and something like this. Now we're moving further to the Vremivka tactical bridgehead. Today this area is a silent area. We haven't received many updates from this bridgehead. We just caught the video from the Ukrainian side of 35th Brigade. This is the 35th Brigade, this one, 38th, 37th, 35th Brigade, Marine Brigade. They published a video how they 54 seconds of video of establishing control over the settlement. We see the happy Ukrainians with the flags and the Ukrainians who are raising their flags above the territory of Urozhaine and confirming the entire control over this territory. The Russians from their side during the day were bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions, trying to slow them down, not to allow them to develop their positions, not to allow them to create a bridgehead and to dig in deeper inside of the settlement. Furthermore, the Ukrainians establish full control over the road that goes from Urozhaine to Staromlinovo and Zavitne Bazhanye. And on this video we see how the Ukrainians discovered the Russian vehicle that were transporting the troopers or some support or evacuation squad. The Ukrainians discovered that armored vehicle and attacked with a drone and basically damaged this vehicle heavily and probably destroyed it in the end. Now let's talk about this area in the global scope. The Ukrainians have captured Urozhaine. I expect that there are going to be a small operational pause for a day or two, not very big, not very long, because the Ukrainians need to continue, maybe while they have some momentum or something like this. But the main problem of the Ukrainians currently is that on this front line, they need to develop their offensive operation further in the direction of Zavitne Bazhanye in this area. So this is the next stop of the Ukrainians. I believe that maybe if the Ukrainians will plan this operation, they can take it, but it's not a very big deal for the Russians. This is not the main defense belt of the Russian forces. It's, if we translate Zavitne Bazhanye in English, it sounds like a hopeful wish or the thing that you want to achieve. So it's like, if we translate, so something very, very interesting, something very, very that you want to achieve. It's like the translation of the settlement. So basically the situation completely corresponds to this title of the settlement. This is the settlement that Ukrainians also want to get, but the problem is that if the Ukrainians continue their offensive operation to the south just along the Mokler-Yala river, there is a very high chances that the Ukrainians will be attacked from the flanks, from the western salient that located between Piryutin and Urozhaine, and from the eastern salient from fields in direction of the northern part of Urozhaine. So basically, if Ukrainians continue attacking to the south, they can be encircled by the Russian forces and there can be created a cauldron. So this is the reason why the Ukrainians at the next stage of offensive operation to the south need to attack this area using the broad frontline attack, and basically the Ukrainians need to attack not just in direction of the settlement but also in direction of Piryutine. But if the Ukrainians want to attack in direction of Piryutine, they need to attack in direction of the fields between Piryutine and Staromayorske. If the Ukrainians want to attack in direction of Zavitne Bazhanye from the east, the Ukrainians need to attack first of all in direction of the fields between the settlements, between Zavitne Bazhanye and Novodonetsk. If the Ukrainians want to attack in direction of these fields, first they need to capture Novodonetsk. But we know the Russian tactics in Novodonetsk that they shown us in the previous stage of defense operation. When the Ukrainians start attacking this area, the Russians try to keep the Ukrainians in a distance. First they destroy the armored vehicles in a distance, and then the Russians retreat towards Novomayorsk. And as soon as artillery destroyed the rest of Ukrainian forces, the Russians from Novomayorsk returns back in direction of Novodonetsk. So if the Ukrainians want to capture Novodonetsk, they need to attack Novomayorsk from the settlement by the name of Prichistovka. If the Ukrainians want to attack from Prichistovka, first they need to blockade the Russian forces in Shevchenkovo. So this is the possible Ukrainian operation, and as you can see, this operation is very huge. This is not just the settlement. Of course, the Ukrainians probably have some chances to get some success by not completing every single step that we just described. But if the Ukrainians are not able to complete every single step from Piryutin to Shevchenkovo, then there is a very high chances that the Russians will repel every single Ukrainian attack, will defeat the Ukrainians, and will counterattack and will force the Ukrainians to step back very, very far from the combat line in direction even towards Velika Novoselka. So the situation is very complicated. There is no half solutions, half decisions. If you want to get the first defense belt and to start real clashes with the real Russian forces along the line of Suvorekin, then you need to do something like this as we just described. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings on South Donetsk area, the Ukrainians lost 140 soldiers, 8 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system. Now we are moving to the South Donetsk area, and as you can see, this area is under complete Russian initiative control. For example, just for the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to destroy at least 2 air defense systems Strela 10. The first video we got at noon time that the Russians were making some intelligence operation, reconnaissance operation. Then we see launch of missile of Strela 10. Basically, the Ukrainians were trying to shut down, but that system missed. The Russians discovered that system. The Ukrainians wanted to redeploy their forces, but the Russians were tracking, of course, and after that they made a very accurate strike with probably Krasnopol, and as a result of that attack, the Ukrainians lost first air defense system. Few hours later, another air defense system was discovered in the settlement by the name of Antonovka. Between the streets, another Strela 10 was moving. The Russians discovered the system. The Ukrainians also was trying to redeploy, to change position, to hide this system somewhere in the forest, but the Russians saw everything, and as a result of artillery strike, another air defense system was destroyed. The difference between these two videos is that in the first video, the Russians destroyed fully loaded Strela 10 system. In the second one, and we saw, like, as a result of explosions, we saw the signs of missiles launching from that destroyed system. In this case, we saw completely fully empty system. Probably that system have launched their missiles right before that attack. So as you can see, the Russians, for example, on operational level, managed to suppress Ukrainian artillery air defense system, and currently they continue offensive operation from the north in direction of Novomikhailivka. And today we have already discussed the video of drone attack in this area. The Russians have almost completed the clearing operation of the southern stronghold, which will give them a possibility to develop their offensive operation to the north. But the main purpose of this offensive operation, of course, is not to capture this stronghold, because there are almost nothing left from this area. The building is completely ruined. The main interest of the Russians in this area have the trenches in Ukrainian fortifications along the forest lines. This is the first area, and this is the second area. If the Russians can penetrate the first defense belt to force the Ukrainians to step back and start advancing to the north, they will be able to get access to these forest lines and to start fightings for them. Because if the Russians, for some reason, as a result of some operation, are able to capture the eastern forest line and the western forest line, then the Russians are able to establish the fire control over the main supply roads that goes in direction of Novomikhailivka, which will force the Ukrainians to start retreating or changing their positions. And the same activity, remember, the Russians are trying to implement from the north by attacking the Ukrainian positions along the forest line in this area. When talking about the progress on the northern flank, the Russians has less progress in comparison with the southern direction. Furthermore, the Russians continue their counter-artillery duels, and as a result of another counter-artillery duel, the Russians managed to discover and to destroy the Ukrainian Caesar somewhere on the west of Marinka. The Caesar that Ukrainians were using to supply and support the Ukrainian forces in the Battle of Krasnogorovka, Marinka, and Novomikhailivka. So minus another artillery system. And if we talk about the Battle of Novomikhailivka, which currently become for the Russians the vital, we see that the main goal and the main purpose of the Russians in the global scope to make possibilities a foothold for a flank attack in direction of the Ukrainian offensive forces to the south. Of course, the distance is very big, but as I understand, if the Russians are able to capture a few settlements like Novomikhailivka, Paraskoivka, Konstantinovka, to enter this territory, to penetrate this defense belt, there is a very high chance that the entire front line will collapse and the Ukrainians will be able to stop the Russians very, very far from the mainland, somewhere in the vicinity of Kurakhova, Uspenovka, Ugledar, somewhere here. And this is too close to the Ukrainian offensive positions, and basically the Ukrainians will be forced to make a lot of regrouping because their flanks and their base will be under Russian attack, under Russian fire, and the situation can be collapsed very easy by this Russian flank attack in this direction. Also, the Russians continue attacking in direction of Krasnogorovka. If you remember, the Russians have already established their bridgehead on the south. Now they're trying to capture the eastern stronghold of that settlement by attacking these positions in the forest lines. For now, there is still a lot of job to do. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes on Donetsk area, the Ukrainians lost around 250 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles and 3 artillery systems. The Russians managed to repel 5 attacks, and the main attacks took place, Ukrainian attacks, in the vicinity of Krasnogorovka and Nivolska. So the Ukrainians were attacking and counter-attacking somewhere in this area, trying to force the Russians to step back from this area because they understand the Russian plans, they understand what exactly the Russians are planning to do and what are they going to do and what they can do if the Ukrainians are not able to force them to step back. Now we are moving to Bakhmut, to Artyomovsk area. The Ukrainians, after small operational pause, continue publishing more updates about their drone strikes against the Russian supply and support roads that goes in direction of Klishchiivka. The Russians published the video how they continue bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions in the forest on the west of that settlement. On this video we see how the Russians destroyed another Bradley that probably was trying to make some rotation or to evacuate some wounded soldiers. The Russians discovered that Bradley, and as a result of artillery strike, that Bradley was destroyed. Also, the Russians continue bombing and shelling the Ukrainian trenches and fortifications in the northern part of Klishchiivka. I will not show this video because of violence and dead bodies on that video. So basically, the Russians also continue forcing the process of attacking the Ukrainian forces in this area, trying to force them to step back from this bridgehead towards Ivanovskaya. And because of that fact that during the previous weeks the Ukrainians were forced to move a lot of forces from this area to the north to Kupiansk, currently the Ukrainians are in defense state, but we see that they don't have enough of artillery superiority, drone superiority forces and so on to stop the Russian offensive operation. And I expect that anyway, sooner or later, the Ukrainians will be forced to step back from this area. Somehow, to slow down the Russians, at least for somehow, the Ukrainians today created and launched another offensive operation in direction of the forest, in direction of Paraskovievka, along the road from Makeivka. The Russians reported that attack started somewhere at 6:30 a.m. of the local time. There was a very fierce clashes, very heavy battles in this area. That attack was repelled by the Russians. The Ukrainians were defeated and were forced to step back. So there are some reserves, of course, and the Ukrainians understand that they can't attack in Klishchiivka because they don't have enough of manpower, they don't have enough of critical mass, but they have some forces to make a very unpleasant attacks from the north, and these attacks can give the Ukrainians some operational time. The Russians anyway will be forced to move some reserves, which will allow the Ukrainians to win some time on the south. So this is basically the situation about Artyomovsk. Now we're moving further to Liman front line. As you can see, that's probably the second or third day or third week or second week in a row without any updates from this bridgehead. Just the local clashes from positional battles from between Russians and the Ukrainians. On this video, we see how the Russians were attacking and bombing the Ukrainian positions with with artillery systems, with manpods, with anti-tank missiles, anti-infantry missiles in this area, but those were just regular clashes for small checkpoints and so on, and small strongholds. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost 55 soldiers. When talking about Kupiansk front line, we also have received almost nothing from this area. No geolocated video, no artillery strikes. It doesn't mean that there are no clashes in this area. I believe that the area there are very fierce battles. The Russians reported that as a result of continuous storming operation in this area, the Ukrainians lost another 85 soldiers. Furthermore, as we discussed in the previous videos, according to some sources, the Ukrainian commanders took a decision to leave Sinkovka and they withdraw their positions and got closer to Petropavlovka. But one more time, no video, no geolocated confirmations, just text messages, some speculations and so on. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings in this area, the Ukrainians lost another 85 soldiers. When talking about Kharkiv area, we also got some updates. The Russians and the Ukrainians continue artillery duels along the border between Belgorod and Kharkov. The Russians published a number of videos how they managed to discover and to destroy the Ukrainian positions, some warehouses, ammo depots, accumulation of Ukrainian forces. So nothing special, just a regular routine on this front line between Russian and Ukrainian forces in this area. Furthermore, the Russians reported that the Ukrainians activated and intensified their actions in the Bryansk region. For example, today, the Ukrainians, during the previous 48 hours, the Ukrainians made few attempts to send their commandos and reconnaissance squad in Bryansk area, and the Russians reported that all those squads were discovered and destroyed by the Russians. The video is linked to this icon, but we will not watch this video because of violence there. And probably that's it for today. Yes, that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.